Welcome students. Today we'll talk about the realist cinema of Satyajit Ray and his urban trilogy of the 1970s. There are three films which can constitute a kind of trilogy which Satyajit Ray made in 1970s. That is in 1970, Pratidwandi, in 1971, Shimabadha, and 1975, Janaranya. Now, like in his early phase of his career, we separated three films and clubbed them together as Opu trilogy because they told the story of a single character in the course of three films. These three films are not depicting a kind of single storyline. They are depicting separate stories in three separate films. But the main thematic concern is roughly the same. That is the city in the 1970s, city of Kolkata in 1970s. In the early phase of his career, Satyajit Ray mainly adapted classic Bengali novels written by Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay, Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay or Rabindranath Tagore, and they were certain stories which were set in the early half of 20th century or in the 19th century. And therefore, there was a general tendency to remark that Satyajit Ray is more comfortable in depicting the past of Bengal, the past of India. But we know that Satyajit Ray also, in his early phase, set some of his films in the contemporary. If you recall Kanchanjunga, if you recall Nayak, Kapurush Mahapurush, and mainly Mahanagar. But in the 1970s, the films differed subtly in a way that here there is a general thematic concern, the thematic concern of contemporary social and political order, which became more important than the characters as such, which is not the same in case of his earlier films like Nayak. For example, Nayak was more or less the depiction of a single character and his biography. But here, instead of the characters, the context, the social context, the political context, they become more important. So, we'll try to understand that how in the 1970s, Satyajit Ray's realism had a kind of shift, a shift which is not drastic, but a shift which can be broadly observed. But previously, before going into the films proper, let's talk about the context. The context was this, that Satyajit Ray in his 1950s and 60s, Satyajit Ray had certain concerns and certain ideas regarding contemporary society, and he was more or less concerned about how the Bengali middle class, how the Bengali intelligentsia, how it shaped it through history. But here now, Satyajit Ray is not bothered about how this entire society is being shaped. He is more bothered how the entire society is now at the present condition. There is one film which can be called the predecessor to the urban trilogy, that is Aur Ne Din Ratri, which was made in 1969. But we won't include this film into the urban trilogy category because this film was not set in Kolkata, in Calcutta. That is, this film is more bothered about certain urban characters, how they behave in an outdoor setting, in a setting which is more of a setting of tourism, more of a setting of a holiday, like Kanchanjunga. So Aur Ne Din Ratri actually has certain kind of resemblance with Kanchanjunga, but Aur Ne Din Ratri depicted certain characters, certain flawed characters, certain new flaws, new kind of concerns they were coming in, and a new youth was coming in Satyajit Ray's films, and this youth was something which was not previously evident in his earlier films.
কাছাকাছি কত মেলা টেলা হচ্ছে বুঝি?
এইটা দেখেছেন, একদম ভুলে গেছি। যাবেন? এই তো খুব কাছে, নদীর ধারে, মিনিট পাঁচেকের পর।
আপনারা যাচ্ছেন?
আমার তো ভীষণ ইচ্ছে জানেন, রিনিরও খুব শখ কাঁচের চুড়ি কিনবার।
নট ব্যাড আইডিয়া, গেলে হয়।
বিকেলে?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, একটু রোদ্দুরটা পড়ুক তারপর।
সেটলড। জুয়া টু আছে, গ্যামলিং?
চোরের মন মস্কার দিকে।
তাস টানতে দিল না, জানেন? কিরম তিনটার জমতে বলুন তো।
এই রিনি, সেই যে কি আমরা একটা খেলতাম রে, তাসে? না না না, তাসের না, সেই যে সেই বিখ্যাত লোকের নাম।
মেমোরি গেম।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, আপনি জানেন?
ব্যাপারটা কিরকম?
এই রিনি, আয় না খেলি।
So what was the context like? We know that in the 1950s and 60s was the era of Nehruvian socialism. It was a period when there was this nation building project going on. India as a new nation was building its predicament, building its future. But by the end of the 1960s, there was a certain gap, a certain kind of divorce between the nation at large and the state. The state as the power, governing power, and the nation constituted the people. Certain interests they came in clash, and certain political agitations they came up. So by the end of the 1960s, there was the leftist movements, the ultra-left movement like Naxalism, they came up, and there was this huge political interest, a kind of lack of faith on the contemporary government, so on and so forth, and it gave rise to a state of unrest, not only in India, but particularly in Bengal, where a steady governance of the Congress party came to a certain kind of crisis, certain kind of halt by the end of the 1960s, and there was this upcoming leftist agitation, leftist opposition against the prevalent government. But this political agitation, it had its mark all over the society, and particularly among the youth. So there was a new youth coming up, a new kind of youth which was coming up with different ideas of history, different ideas of the contemporary, and different expectations from the political order as such. And there was a strong leftist minded youth coming up who was more interested, a kind of impatient leftist youth was more looking forward to a kind of rather drastic overthrow of the present political order. So in this situation, Satyajit Ray was making films. But if we look at the cinematic context, then we'll see that throughout the 1960s, films all over the world, either in East Europe or in Latin America or in Africa, all over the world, there were countries which were coming out of colonialism, countries which was waging war against colonialism, and one of the main country here would be Vietnam and the Latin American countries, and there were this political struggle against the older order, and the coming up of the new order is putting its mark, is getting articulated through new kind of cinemas. So we have the new wave where Jean-Luc Godard became a spearhead of a certain kind of engaged political filmmaking. We had the Latin American cinema, which was redefining popular cinema in a new kind of way and giving birth to a kind of film movement called the third cinema, which differs from the first cinema, that is the mainstream cinema like Hollywood, or the second cinema, that is the auteuristic art cinema. There was a new kind of cinema coming in the entire world in a post-colonial condition, in a war against colonialism as such. And this kind of films, they gave birth to a new political energy, to a new kind of cinematic language. And this cinematic language in India was already evident in Mrinal Sen's Bhuvan Shom, which was released in 1969 and which gave birth to a film movement which was called the New Indian Cinema Movement, which featured filmmakers like Mrinal Sen, Adur Gopalakrishnan, Mani Kaul, Kumar Sahani, G. Aurobinden, so on and so forth. Now, Satyajit Ray, in this context, was a veteran, was a man whom everyone looked upon for inspiration, but his language, the language of his cinema, become to many contemporary cine enthusiasts become a bit obsolete. So Satyajit Ray was also in a a need to renew his language of cinematic realism. Unlike Mrinal Sen, he was not willing to give up realism as such, but he needed to change his realism in a certain kind of way so that the earlier lyrical humanist kind of stories can pave way for a kind of cinema which is more concerned about politics, which is more concerned about the unrest in the youth, so on and so forth. In Opu trilogy, we saw how Opu came from the rural heartland of Bengal and arrived in Kolkata in a kind of tryst with modernity, in a passage to modernity, and how Opu, through pains and trials and tribulations, slowly became a modern man. So in Urban Trilogy, Satyajit Ray is looking at how this modern man is now faring in his contemporary. How this man, who actually moved towards a certain kind of certainty in a newer kind of India, how this man is functioning in a new situation, in the India which was envisioned. And like many other contemporary filmmakers, we see in Ray's films a marked, drastic political cynicism in these films. Almost a lack of faith on the steady path towards modernity, towards enlightenment, and almost a lack of faith on the progress of civilization as such. The first film, which can be called the first film of the trilogy, which loosely called the trilogy, that is Pratidwandi, or the English name is The Adversary, and this film was an adaptation of Shulin Gangopadhyay's novel. And in this film we see Satyajit Ray is trying to create a new kind of protagonist, a kind of protagonist who was not previously seen in his films. A protagonist who is angry, a young, embittered, angry man who is reacting to the society in a way. One can say that through this film, Satyajit Ray was trying to understand the contemporary political youth. And with it, largely came a new kind of film language. So previously, as in Bhuvan Som, we saw many kind of experiments in cinematic language which actually broke the spell of cinematic realism in a drastic, radical way. Now, Satyajit Ray was not willing to give up the realism as a form. Realism was his form. And in this time, Satyajit Ray wrote an essay, one of his longest essays he has written, An Indian New Wave, ? Where he questioned certain aspects of the new Indian cinema which was slowly emerging. But we see that ironically, Satyajit Ray, who was questioning the new Indian cinema, is also trying to fashion a new kind of language in his films too. So in Pratidwandi, we see lot of experimentations, like lot of cutaways in negative marks. So you see suddenly the entire image growing negative and changing into certain kind of way. So we see that lot of changes are happening, lot of changes in cinematic language, canted shots, sudden cutaways, sudden non-fictional modes. They are coming in Satyajit Ray's cinema, which was in his earlier phase a kind of unprecedented. It was not expected in his earlier phase. It's suddenly coming in. And when Satyajit Ray was asked that why he was suddenly doing this new kind of things, this new kind of experiments, which was actually not familiar with his style. Satyajit said that he is doing it to depict the mindscape of the character, mindscape of the lead character. So we can say that this is a new thing to come in. Actually, it's not entirely new in Satyajit's career. Previously, also in Charulata, we saw a particular sequence where we get a peep into Charulata's mind, and suddenly the realist depiction goes away to create a section which can neither be called flashback nor it can be called a certain avant-garde experimentation. So we saw this type of things happening in race films before, in one particular occasion at least. But here, Rai was deliberately doing those kind of experimentations again and again to create the mindscape of a certain character. So in Pratidwandi, Rai is taking his protagonist, a particular character, and his standard leading man, that is Soumitra Chatterjee, paves way to make way for a newer star, that is Dhritiman Chatterjee, who depicts a certain kind of youth we previously didn't see in Rai's films. And so in a famous interview sequence, we see that when Siddhartha, the protagonist, is being asked about the most significant event in contemporary times, he says that it's the Vietnamese people's struggle against colonial powers, rather than the man landing on the moon or so on and so forth.
What would you regard as the most outstanding and significant event of the last decade?
The war in Vietnam, sir.
More significant than the landing on the moon?
I think so, sir.
Could you tell us why you think so?
Because the moon landing, you see, we weren't entirely unprepared for the moon landing. We knew it had to come sometime. We knew about the space flights, the great advances in space technology. So we knew it had to happen. I'm not saying it wasn't a remarkable achievement, but it wasn't unpredictable. The fact that they did land on the moon.
Do you think the war in Vietnam was unpredictable?
Not the war itself, but what it has revealed about the Vietnamese people, about their extraordinary power of resistance. Ordinary people, peasants, and no one knew they had it in them. And this isn't a matter of technology, it's just plain human courage, and it takes your breath away.
Are you a communist?
I don't think one has to be one in order to admire Vietnam, sir.
So this is definitely a politically redefined youth. So in Pratidwandi we see Satyajit is trying to find a character who makes certain political affirmative action. Not very unlike the character Arati in Mahanagar. But here is a new character. In Mahanagar, Arati does something, she protests out of ethics. But Siddhartha's protest is more conditioned by the contemporary society, so on and so forth. In Shimabadha, the protagonist is flawed. So unlike any other films before any other films of Satyajit Ray we saw before, Shimabadha starts with a mock documentary manner, tracing the journey of the lead character Shyamolendu from Patna down to Calcutta. And throughout Shimabadha, Satyajit looks how an enlightened, a man created out of Western education, English education, out of enlightenment, how a man has become a corrupt character.
কোনটা আমার ঘোড়া সেটা চিনব কি করে?
কেন ওই তো ঘোড়ার গায়ে নাম্বার লেখা রয়েছে yours is number 6
6 আমার জন্ম তারিখ
হ্যালো
কে?
মিস্টার ফেরিস এমডি
ডাক্তার?
managing director.
And we see that in Shotitra's cinema, we see in these films a standard presence of a woman, of a female protagonist who acts like that of a conscience keeper. So Sharmila Thakur actually acted in a similar role in Aranyar Din Ratri. Now Sharmila Thakur also acts in a similar role in Shimabaddo as the sister-in-law of the lead character, and she actually constantly judges the lead character, and the lead character comes under a moral scanner of the conscience. And we see how Shyamulendu, the lead character, who has now become a very successful officer in a British merchant house, how he is slowly becoming a corrupt man. So one can say for the first time in Shotitra's entire career, we see Shotitra depicting a protagonist on whom he has lost all faith. So if Pratitwandi is the attempt to put a faith on a modern educated individual, Shimabaddo states a kind of failure on that individual, because the difference between Siddhartha of Pratitwandi and Shyamulendu of Shimabaddo is that Siddhartha is becoming a political being and Shyamulendu is consciously becoming an apolitical being. After Shimabaddo, Shotritra takes a kind of break from the contemporary, and he makes documentaries. One of the documentary is Sikkim, which got immediately banned because of certain political reasons. Then he made a portrait of his mentor, the blind artist Binod Bihari Mukhopadhyay, called The Inner Eye. Then he adapted again a classic novel by Bibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, which is set in the 1940s, during the famines of the 1940s. And he makes a children film, which is actually a detective story, a rather adventure film, one can say, with certain sinister overtones. And Shotritra comes back in a film which one can easily describe as his most scathing, angry film, called Jon Aranya in 1975. So by 1975, the political unrest which began in the end of the 1960s and the beginning of 1970s, it has already died down. It had died down under severe state repression. But the entire scenario is poised for a kind of political change. And Shotritra is making his most dark film in Jon Aranya.
আর পারলাম না সোমনাথ, তুমি তো জানো ওরা কিভাবে পেছনে লেগেছে আমার। দিন রাত কানের কাছে ওই এক কথা, ওরা এত কম বয়স, কবে সেটেল হবে কিছু ঠিক নেই, একদিন হাঁ করে বসে থাকার কোনো মানে হয় না।
তুমি রাজি হয়ে গেলে?
So in Jon Aranya, we see Somnath, that is the lead character in the film. He turns out to be the weakest character in almost the entire oeuvre of Shotritra. A character who is so weak that his corruption doesn't bring us any sense of pathos. We see Somnath is a guy who has just, because of certain misfunctioning in the system, a guy who has just become a past graduate, that is a graduate without any honors, and he is in desperate need of a job. And then we see that when he tries to find a job, he lands up in Boro Bazar. So something strange happens in Shotritra's world. Previously we saw in his films, we saw a Bengal which is enlightened by the 19th century movements and enlightened Bengal. And now in Jon Arno, we see a Bengal, a Calcutta, which was kept outside enlightenment. And we see a whole community of small businessmen, petty businessmen, who suddenly is giving a kind of rights of education, a kind of dark education to the lead character, and the character slowly and slowly turning into a kind of middleman. The English name of the film was Middleman. Jon Arno means the forest of people, and the English name is the middleman. He becomes a kind of middleman, and slowly this term middleman, it turns metaphorical as we see finally the character being reduced into a kind of pimp who has to search out for prostitutes to kind of serve to his clients, to make his kind of deals.
বেশি দিচ্ছেন।
জানি। সুকুমার কেমন আছে?
ভালো।
চাকরি পেয়েছে?
ট্যাক্সি চালাচ্ছে।
ও এসেছেন, আপনি আসুন। মিস্টার ব্যানার্জি তাহলে নিচে ওয়েট করুন, আমি আপনাকে জানাবো।
So this entire predicament is a very dark kind of predicament in what one can say is Satyajit Ray's most underrated film. And we see a new kind of space, a new kind of Calcutta, a new host of new characters with weird type of humor, a humor which is laced with sarcasm, something which was previously not found in the gentle lyrical world of Satyajit Ray. Jon Arno is a film where the lyrical humanism of Satyajit Ray goes away and gives forth and brings forth, makes way to a very dark, cynic world where Satyajit Ray has lost all trust on education, on progress, on enlightenment. So to conclude, we can say that in Urban Trilogy, Satyajit Ray adapts to the contemporary times in his kind of way, not by discarding his realism, but actually tuning his realism in a new kind of way, giving way to new kind of cinematic experimentations, new kind of cinematic languages, new kind of cinematic devices to come in, and portraying characters where the characters are not larger than the settings, but the settings overwhelm the character. The setting conditions the character. The characters become something who cannot escape the humongous, overarching, overwhelming contemporary society.